This is a topic that's kind of near and dear to me, and I was excited to sort of consolidate my thoughts on the issue. Ravanti has deployed lots of Copilot through lots of AI initiatives at organizations in various different industries. And we've been doing that since Copilot was generally available, so certainly over a year or two now. And noticing some trends and salient points in terms of what organizations that are seeing ROI are doing and might be doing differently than perhaps other organizations that are claiming they're not seeing ROI from. So I think it's an important topic. I think it's an important topic for folks evaluating their own AI initiatives, who ultimately need to speak to those sorts of measurements to continue their AI journey. So yeah, we'll dive right into it. Might not need the full hour, but we got time for Q&A. But essentially, I thought we'd start with a too long didn't read, just to sort of frame the conversation with some high-level learnings, and then go ahead and sort of unpack those as we go through the rest of the discussion. And I think the main sort of piece of work that we're looking at, the main sort of input we're looking at, is that MIT paper that came out last summer, claiming that 95% of organizations fail to realize ROI from their AI investments. I think that's sort of the scary possibility that prompts a lot of these discussions and has sort of taken up a life since the publication. So I'll talk a little bit about what I thought was flawed with that and what I think was really important insights with that. But then we'll get right into what we've seen succeed, hopefully in a really practical way, along with what a good AI partner looks like based upon what we've seen being successful from other organizations' deployments. And then we'll take a look at our work in doing both pilots and production rollouts for Copilot, followed by some Q&A. So if there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat there, and we'll pick those up as soon as we can. So the TLDR is essentially, again, we're looking at organizations that have done really three things. And these will all be unpacked as we go along. But first, have successfully demonstrated in an empirical fashion ROI with AI. And honestly, for the purposes of this discussion, it could be any LLM, it could be any AI tooling. The lessons learned here really aren't that significantly different. The second thing is we're looking at organizations that have taken that ROI as a justification to move past some sort of experimental phase, some sort of pilot phase, in order to deploy more broadly to the organization as a whole. So now this has become organization-wide effort and deployment, and let's call it transformation. And lastly, that they've used those first two steps as a way to then move from AI assistant to agents, basically continuing that journey to a frontier organization. And how are they doing this? I think I just tried to TLDR it in 4 buckets. But first, vision's important. Vision's sort of required at the very outset when formulating our thoughts and getting some directional input on where and how we'd like to use AI and what we might like to see from it. But the technology is changing so quick. The use cases are so specific that short from just some directional input, really what we've seen be successful are folks that share a track record rather than a vision. So a track record of small successes that are measurable and quantifiable and stringing those together, rather than a large vision that's not tangible, can't be interacted with, can't be measured, etc. The second point here is also too that track record's made up of these narrow but high value use cases that prove out ROI. So we'll talk a lot about workflows and process. And what we've seen be successful is folks will take a process and then we'll take a thin section of the process, maybe a task cluster or something like that, and go ahead and experiment, iterate, optimize with AI for that set of tasks in order to, let's say, reduce time or improve accuracy or improve quality, otherwise prove out ROI. And then great, that's a win that they can report on, and then they move on maybe to the next tasks in that process or workflow, etc. So stringing those together is what creates that track record we spoke about earlier. The other thing too is important is, to do this work, to find those wins, to do the work in terms of iteration, experiment, measure, iterate, optimize, to do that within less than 90 days. If it's longer than 90 days, perhaps it gives us pause, since we want to sort of quickly prove out and even forecast what ROI might look like with AI-assisted tasks, processes, etc. And the last item here is really just sort of what does that flow look like? This is prescriptive, but it also comes about organically, quite organically in organizations we've seen succeed at this, is they baseline their work today. How long does it take me to complete a task? How long does it take our department to get from this point to the next department? What is the error rate? Things like that. Baseline the tasks, identify AI-assisted, say, prompts to facilitate those tasks, pilot those AI-assisted workflows, measure the delta between the baseline and the AI-assisted results, and then go on to iterate from there. Maybe refining prompts, maybe rolling out to more users to see how the department as a whole is recognizing ROI, etc. So at a high level, those are sort of the four categories in which organizations seem to operate in a way that gets them to be successful and further the AI journey. So I mentioned the MIT paper, which is here. I called it the elephant in the room. The title of the paper starts with the Gen AI divide and then goes on to opine on, the state of AI in business. But the Gen AI divide, it's really, this gap between, and let me get my laser pointer here. It's really this gap between, early experimentation and then getting into a formal pilot. And the AI divide is really how many organizations go from a pilot to a production rollout. And you can see that number here for agentic or task-specific AI, that's 5%. So that's where some of those attention-grabbing headlines come from. But that's the divide right there, is how do you move from that middle bar to the right-hand bar? And it's, the critical gap between experimentation and then doing something that's scalable and durable and provides lasting ROI that can be inspected anytime. So it's a little bit like Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, if folks are familiar with that. From how do we get from experimentation to widespread adoption, but slightly different. So, the big headline here for this paper, and I'm sure we're all familiar, is 95% of organizations are getting zero return. And some of the issues or limitations of the paper were the following on here. First, the study was conducted in just 6 months, or over the course of 6 months. And success value was defined as bottom line profitability that one could see in a P&L sheet. Now, I don't really know of any other technology that has been benchmarked in that way, where in 2 quarters we expect to see bottom line impact that's meaningful or significant. It's a pretty tough benchmark to beat and to win at. So that makes it tricky. A lot of times, especially as well, if we're talking about efficiencies and optimization, that's not going to appear in P&L for some time. That might appear elsewhere, for example, say reduced costs with business process outsourcing, things like that. But this bar is a little high and perhaps unrealistic and a little misleading. Also, too, the study was overwhelmingly, by its own admission, was sort of overwhelmingly concerned with folks that decided to build their own, whether that's models, agents, etc., rather than buy something that a partner had already provided, like Microsoft or Copilot as an example. Something that was more or less shovel ready from a security perspective, from a product perspective in terms of its ability to reason and be competitive with other products, etc. And lastly, the study was pretty limited in terms of its sample size and quantitative data. I think this was done largely by survey from 153 executives across, I believe, maybe 50 or so organizations. As we'll see here, and I hope is evident, surveying executives, first of all, the survey itself is probably going to elicit qualitative responses. Oh, I felt like this, or people didn't feel like this, rather than something more quantitative or empirical. Secondly, as we'll see, by talking to the executives, you kind of lose this critical part of the loop and part of the whole initiative, which is the actual workers who are steeped in the day-to-day workflows and who are incorporating AI into those tasks and workflows. So that's where I think some of this study gets a little hampered. Where I think there are some really great insights are the following. I mean, they say success is less a function of model quality. These models, maybe it varies from week to week, and maybe we're talking milliseconds in response times, or however this is measured, but the models themselves aren't wildly superior or inferior to each other. So it's less a matter of product and model quality than it is of approach, and that being the success of a pilot and the ability to move from pilot to production rollout. So that made a lot of sense, and we see that day to day in our deployments. The other thing the paper calls out is, to find high value, narrow footholds where organizations will see the most ROI. That's sort of those slices of workflows that are manageable. It's not an end-to-end process re-envisioning. It's rather, let's see in our existing processes what we can do with some AI assistance to optimize that and drive efficiencies. Similarly, too, this was sort of captured in the TLDR, but these small visible wins were serialized and strung together and presented to leadership and to the folks involved in order to get licensed to move forward and expand, whether that was some budget to, say, move on to creating agents from those prompts, or whether to roll out to further groups or to an entire organization, etc. It was those visible small wins strung together that really proved out the case for, say, CFOs, COOs, boards, etc. The other interesting thing too, and we'll talk more about this, is where do you find those wins? More often than not, you'll find those wins in these kind of administratively heavy but back of office tasks that are not necessarily always top line revenue producing, right? Sales and marketing, those are very attractive use cases and areas to tackle, and I don't disagree with that at all. But you don't want to over index on those and forget about all of the possible efficiencies and ROI you can see with your existing operations and processes that keeps that going. In fact, back of office processes are probably more proceduralized than sort of those front office, top of funnel sorts of activities. So this is where you see kind of this outsized impact, high ROIs, high impact for work that AI is perfectly suited for. And then lastly, we'll touch on it at the end, but already this frames AI and AI adoption and the AI journey in an interesting light, where partners, whether that be Microsoft or folks like Rovanti who do the actual boots on the ground deployment, need to behave less like SaaS sellers and more like business process outsourcing consultants. And hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense as we go on from here. So what we've seen succeed, what we've seen folks do that has allowed them to, successfully go from the pilot mode and make that leap to wider production rollout. Here's a verbatim from the paper itself that companies who successfully cross the Gen AI divide, win those small visible wins. So the pitfalls with this are an under-supported rollout or over-planning. And this is actually a bit of a mouthful. So I'll start with under-supported rollout. By under-supported rollout, I mean a number of different possibilities. This could be like insufficient licensing, and we've seen it many times, where organizations say, you know what, I'll buy 10 or 20 licenses, I'll give them out to maybe some executives or IT, and we'll see what happens. We'll let them play with it and see where it goes from there. And typically those folks will experiment and it'll catch their interest for maybe 2 weeks or so, and then perhaps lose interest and write off any further investment. We also see some insufficient organization around use case identification and the baselining and measurement, which we mentioned, sort of forms the basis upon which you can justify expanding the program. Same thing with the training to those use cases that were identified that'll make this maximally sort of valuable. So when these things are under supported with the rollout, just pulling up my notes here. Because I don't want to miss this point. So when this is in any of those senses under supported, I mean, recall that the main problem, the Gen AI divide itself, is about how to scale AI. So the problem with under supporting a rollout is that rollout was never built to scale in the first place. So whether intentionally or not, like a really small pilot of 10 to 20 users, it's just going to sit outside of the workflows where the actual value will be sort of maximal and is where that value scales, is in those workflows rather than outside of those workflows as, say, a personal productivity tool for 1 or 2 individuals. And that would be just highlighting individual and anecdotal productivity, rather than providing like this durable, shareable piece of knowledge and skill sets that you can transfer to other folks. And then, just a few more notes. There's just not enough signal density to be able to get some meaningful quantitative data from, or to be able to iterate quickly enough, identify edge cases. I use enough of that sort of signal density, or enough of that use to be able to optimize properly, etc. It's much easier when there are teams of folks working on this, working in similar workflows, etc. And then lastly, again, if it's sort of siloed, if it's a handful of licenses distributed, however they're distributed, those benefits are just going to be imperceptible, because again, they're not embedded in the workflows themselves. So that's the under-supported. The flip side of that is over-planning, which most folks are very susceptible to. It seems like an important and prudent idea to really plan as much of your AI journey as possible. The issue, however, is that the technology is changing at a rapid clip. So those roadmaps and those plans might not look the same or have the same meaning or weight literally from 1 month to the next. The other pieces of over-planning we could just take from these bullets below. Folks will want to be autonomous before they're assistive, and we'll talk more about that. But folks first move out of the gate, or impulses perhaps, let's build agents, and let's create an agent or set of agents that can handle a whole process or workflow end to end, rather than taking that narrow slice. So that's also kind of a build first versus buy first. Folks are wanting to build these agents before they first buy, say, a human assistant to work through some of those details and learnings. Now, what has worked is assistive before autonomous. So people starting with human plus assistant, finding again those narrow, high impact use cases that's going to follow us throughout this whole discussion. Doing some disciplined and earnest experimentation on how to leverage AI within those workflows, measuring, iterating, etc. And doing that by the folks who actually do the work day to day, and getting their input and taking their input really as the source material for that stuff. So a few high-level sort of things, lessons learned here is, assistive before autonomous. So what do we mean by this? Human plus assistant is really, every employee has an AI assistant, let's say, that helps them work better and faster. This is 100% human in the loop. So it's really the agent like Copilot, like I'll put it in a Microsoft context. Microsoft 365 Copilot is that human AI assistant. And it's helping folks get more done, and doing it perhaps with higher quality and less risk exposure because of that quality, because of that accuracy, etc. So in phase one, you're not fundamentally reimagining work or changing the nature of people's role. Their role's still the same. I'm still responsible for, say, the procurement process and due diligence that goes into that. Or I'm still responsible for, say, the bid solicitation process, my estimation process, tracking and monitoring addenda, and going to RFP. I'm still responsible for all of that. However, components of that are just made more efficient and optimized through my use of Microsoft 365 Copilot. In phase two, there are agents. This is still also very much human in the loop, but now we've created agents who will do those slices of work, and we work together with them But these agents provide different levels of expertise. Say one's handling this section, say the RFP process. Another one's handling, say, the addenda and review of contracts and comparing differences in language or requirements, or et cetera. But still, humans are now still in the loop and almost like managers, right? Inspecting work before it goes out, clarifying context and tasks, things like that. And then phase 3, this is sort of the full frontier vision. Not many organizations are here yet because, frankly, there just hasn't been enough time, but it's coming, and I'm sure we're all familiar with that literature. So this is where agents are acting autonomously. Human is much less in the loop, checking in periodically to just ensure quality control. So what does assistive look like? You know, AI is about the work, not the technology. So AI, it's a general intelligence. It's not purpose-built. It's not like, you know, we used to use this platform for one thing, and now we switched different platforms. It needs to be discovered and understood and customized to your organization. You know, the people who, you know, you need to enable and empower the team. Basically, you're turning them into makers, almost like mini product managers. So we need to give those folks guidelines around what AI is capable of, perhaps an acceptable use policy, and allow them to do some organized experimentation with those AI assistants. And then lastly, you know, people who perform the work, let them experiment with AI. They are best suited to critique the work, approve the work, adjust context, adjust the prompting, etc. And lastly, they're in the best position to identify high impact use cases. But how does assistive now get us to autonomous? So I think there's some anxiety about, well, if we're just using human with assistant, how are we ever going to get to this agentic world? And it's actually somewhat elegant in my mind, because the human and assistant phase 1 really is part of that frontier journey. And the human and assistant provides this important and critical lower risk path, faster path to becoming a frontier firm, and actually accelerates that. So as an example, we're working with a firm now. They're already well into agents. They started with AI Copilot about a year ago. And at the time we were introduced to them, they were looking at other LLMs, other products. They weren't even finalized on which AI platform to move forward with. And in just the course of a year, through some disciplined and steady progress, they are now an AI-enabled firm with agents consistently being released to take over more and more of their processes and workflows. And just a quick final note on, you know, again, how does that get us to autonomous? I almost look at human with assistant as, you know, human being, let's call it a product manager, and the assistant being a product. And, you know, we are iterating on this. We're creating MVPs. We're trying out various prompts to see if we're getting outputs and responses that fulfill what we need in terms of getting our work done. And we're iterating and we're optimizing that, and ultimately enabling our peers to use that same set of prompts that we used to get wider use. And then once we have basically all of those requirements, and in fact, the actual content of the prompts, you kind of have everything you need to shift that over and start developing those agents. And you can agentify that and then move on to the next slice of work. So this is, just a lower cost, lower risk, faster time to value, almost like a minimum viable product model that uses champions as product managers, allows you to decompose workflows in a way that's tested and proved out that we've got it right and we're getting the right kinds of responses and outputs, allows us to iterate and optimize those. And then ultimately, after getting more folks involved, if we're finding that it's got sufficient ROI and sufficient impact, great, we sort of codify that and make that an agent. So you could see a lot of this rests on use cases and finding the right use case. So, we've already discussed, I think, the first two items on the sidebar. What you see in the table here is really just a nice little criteria for identifying what might be a valuable, high impact, low risk use case that you might want to tackle first. Is it time consuming but low value for humans? Or is it repetitive and rule based and therefore very much available to consistent AI prompting, consistent outputs, and ultimately creating agents around it? Do we have good inputs for it? Is that available today? Can an AI assistant use those great inputs and run with that? Another great sort of litmus test is, can you, on the back of a napkin, map out the workflow process? Is the process sufficiently simple where we can get a good start to sort of create a set of prompts or chain of prompts to carry out that work for us? So this will be included if anyone's interested. I think we'll have some leave behinds, but this will be included in that. Now, once we sort of identified, it's almost like a brainstorming session. Like, let's talk about our work. Let's Department A, let's talk about the work we do on a day-to-day basis, month-to-month basis, quarterly, what have you. Let's look at it through this lens. And then let's start to put this on paper and think a little bit more structured about these various use cases we're just identifying and sort of putting into a queue. So what I've developed here, and we'll have, and not just me, our whole team, and we'll leave this for you folks as a leave behind, but we've got this scoring rubric here. Bear with me. And I'll just turn off my camera for this. So first we've got, you saw that use case criteria guide, which again just sort of helps frame what it is we're looking for before we go ahead and put content to that. Then I've got a little legend here with a few things. Items in green are inputs that you can change. So what's the average hourly rate for your workers or department? That'll help us measure and quantify ROI as we go and baseline it. And then we have the cost of the licensing, so that ultimately we can get some understanding about what break even might look like. And it's shockingly low. And then here we've got a scoring rubric. You can change these weights as you like, but basically we've got business value versus integration complexity versus enterprise risk. And then what happens here is, you start to put in your use cases, identify the roles, departments, maybe you're adding some further information. But then as we're scoring these, that composite score changes. So something that is, very high complexity, very high integration risk for a medium business value is going to score low. Whereas something that has a lot of impact, but low complexity and risk is going to score high, and we can quickly start to identify you know what, for this department, I think we've got 7 use cases where we can find some high impact use cases that would allow us to post some wins in order to, justify us moving along and broadening our rollout of Copilot. And then you see we've got frequency, what the KPI is, because this is how it will be measured and ultimately quantified. And then number of users gives us a sense about a scale. So if 60 users are doing something weekly for 30 minutes, what does that look like annual? And what could the reduction in time be? What could the savings be, as an example? So I've got some forecasts here, which might provide some targets or benchmarks. So we use this in this and more in all of our deployments, and hopefully that's a helpful, structured way to identify use cases and to start to think about them to set you up for some success. Okay, well, that was a lot. But now taking some of that and just discussing about what a good AI partner looks like. So this was really interesting and exciting to me. Basically, that MIT paper, these are 2 quotes from it. Basically, that organizations that successfully cross the Gen AI divide approach their procurement of AI differently. And they act like business process outsource clients, not SaaS customers. And then that second quote just goes on to say, and then folks that have a sort of strategic partnership like this are 2 times more likely to reach full deployment and therefore cross that Gen AI divide than folks who don't have that or go it alone internally. And this is meaningful for me because this is what we do with our clients, and it's just a great point. So, the table to the right is really, through the lens of a BPO consultant versus a SaaS sales executive. So BPO consultants, act as an organizational change agent rather than an enablement team. Success is really KPI driven, like by throughput and quality and business outcomes and improvement versus, say, seats activated, feature adoption, did somebody renew or not? And the KPIs are different as well. We're talking BPO KPIs like, did the cost per transaction go down? Were we able to close more tickets successfully this reporting period? Versus, say, how many prompts were done? How many times was this document accessed? What's the monthly active use, etc. So, this is my little hot take here, and it's, maybe a little hyperbole, but, a strong and effective AI partner should, behave like a BPO consultant that happens to use AI rather than a SaaS company that happens to sell AI. And so, I'm just continually impressed with the conversations we have routinely with clients, like these questions below, like who's responsible for the process, throughput, quality, etc. Like who's getting that call when the process breaks? Or where are your most expensive people doing the least valuable or differentiated work? Or, what external vendors are doing internal work that maybe doesn't need to be the case with some AI assistants? Or where have you added headcount without reducing cycle times or completion times or improving quality or hitting KPIs? And then, of course, if we could shave off 30% of this workload, however that's measured, accuracy, risk averted, ROI, etc. What would you do differently with that time? What could we then do? So those are really interesting questions. Those are really materially sort of different kinds of questions than maybe what a software vendor might be asking, but they're absolutely required for an AI initiative to be successful. Okay, so here's what we're doing in the space. We call this Copilot Pack 365. And this is sort of a tried and true offering. We won an award for this, but it's a Copilot pilot. And to give you an idea, this is where, let me throw on that laser pointer again. This is where this sort of sits in our overall Copilot journey. And you see, again, this is the pilot phase. So it's just before this Gen AI divide. But moving up to that, as a side note, early on, we realized that that clients need some set of discussions. It's always a committee-based purchase. There's always multiple stakeholders in the decision to move forward with AI, whatever specific tool set that might be. So we're prepared to meet folks wherever they are, whether that's talking with information security about the data security requirements, whether that's talking about how Copilot stacks up against other LLMs and what the benefits and trade-offs might be, whether that's talking about deployment timelines, etc. That's something that we absolutely try to help folks with. And then there's our Copilot Explorer, which is essentially doing that use case analysis and elicitation. It's a multiple day set of discussions. But ultimately, I'll focus on the actual deployment of Copilot in a pilot scenario. So essentially, Copilot pilots involve always two items. Technical readiness, which is the data security. That's sort of step zero before enabling any AI to index your data and potentially serve up responses that aren't appropriate to the user's permissions. And then the adoption and change management, which is where a lot of what we've been discussing today sits. So this Copilot Pack 365 is really designed to address both items holistically so that data is secure, restrictions are in place, those are understood by our technical counterparts at our clients. And then secondarily, to provide that structured pilot experience and custom trainings based upon the actual use cases organizations bring to us to do the best possible evaluation from day one. So really, there's three objectives for us in these engagements. It's first to enable Copilot users to be productive and productively assess how Copilot works within their workflows. So they have an understanding of the capabilities. We have an understanding of the unique processes that belong to the organization, and we train to those so that we give it the best possible shake and evaluation. Then second, we provide quantitative and qualitative data around that pilot as a summary in order to give folks all of the information they would need to confidently assess the success of the pilot, the ROI, and make a decision that's informed about whether or not to move forward to cross that Gen AI divide with a production rollout. And third, if that discussion were had to, yep, this makes sense financially, this makes sense in terms of productivity, et cetera, we also provide rationalization around licenses. So for example, who could get Copilot Chat, which is included in most Copilot licenses? What's the user profile for somebody who just maybe needs Teams Premium for, say, meeting notes, minutes, things like that? And who should best get Microsoft 365 Copilot? So it'll help you do some of that as well. And the deliverables in here, again, this is just the change management piece. You know, it's the task assessment surveys. It's the use cases by business value, applications, where that work takes place. It's an assessment of those use cases by the core primitive capabilities of Copilot and AI. This is probably one of the more culminating things. It's creating a dashboard, an actual pipeline that our clients will interact with to manage the use cases and determine which ones are next, and to track the ones that are in flight that we're piloting right now. And then, you know, we saw that rubric, and then just summarizing the use cases by thematically. So all of that's really, it's a 10 to 12 week engagement. It could be as short as 8 weeks, but typically we find folks want time to have their users be supported and trained and interacting with Copilot before sort of doing a final summation and reviewing the data that we've collected. So that's what we do. We've got office hours, training webinars, online self-serve kits. It's impressive, and it's all tailored. But the culminating sort of event is the results review, which looks something like this. And this is from an actual client of ours. And you can see that this client had 61 pilot users over the course of 1 month, so 21 working days. And in the course of that month, they had 747 Copilot assisted hours, which at that $72 an hour rate, hourly rate, amounts to almost $54,000 worth of AI assisted value. And that hourly rate, that's their figure. That's adjustable. That's a figure that they came to us and said, this is a number we have confidence in, and we can use this for our reporting. And then similarly, through surveys pre and post pilot, we get qualitative information. And there's a lot to this. This is just one snapshot of the report, but you can see we're asking multiple various questions, seeing how those are scored. Each of these questions has like more and more verbatims, but these are the actual verbatims about, at the end of the day, how would you feel if we took this product away from you now that you've piloted it for 3 to 4 weeks? And how do you feel about each of these categories, whether it's improved your productivity or do you trust the responses, items like that. Okay, well, I've gone on. Like I mentioned, we will make the deck available, and we'll make the use case scoring rubric available. But if there's any questions, happy to chat about those. Otherwise, I think we're almost at time.